In the dense jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province, 1969, Viet Cong soldiers freeze at a sound they've learned to fear. That sound, the unmistakable rhythm of rotor blades cutting through humid air. It means only one thing. The Australians are coming. From Saigon to the Australian Task Force base at Nui Dat, one thing became clear early in the war. Whoever controlled the skies controlled the battlefield. And in the provinces where Australian forces operated, the sky belonged to them. This is the story of how Australian Army aviators, outnumbered, operating in some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, became one of the most feared and respected helicopter forces in Vietnam. The Bell UH-1 Iroquois. The Americans called it the Huey. The Australians simply called it their lifeline. And for the enemy hiding in the jungle below, it represented something else entirely. Death from above. But this wasn't just about firepower. This was about precision, about courage, about flying into hell to bring your mates home. The Viet Cong had faced American helicopters before, but the Australians, they flew different, thought different, fought different. And over the course of Australia's decade in Vietnam, that difference would save thousands of lives and earn the respect of friend and foe alike. Nui Dat, the Australian Task Force base in Phuoc Tuy Province. Every morning before first light, the airfield came alive with a particular kind of organized chaos. The 161st Independent Reconnaissance Flight. Later, the entire 1st Aviation Regiment. These weren't just pilots. They were a brotherhood, forged in the crucible of jungle warfare. Every helicopter required a minimum crew of 4: pilot, co-pilot, crew chief, door gunner. But that was just the beginning. Behind every flight were the engineers, who kept birds airworthy in impossible conditions, the armorers loading ammunition belts, the medics preparing their kits for the inevitable calls. Flying in Vietnam required skills no training manual could teach. You learned to read the jungle canopy like a book, looking for clearings barely larger than your rotor diameter. You learned to feel your aircraft, to know by instinct when you were pushing it too hard. The Australians developed their own doctrine. American pilots often flew high and fast. The Aussies went low and slow, just above the treetops, using terrain masking to avoid detection. It was riskier. It required absolute concentration, but it worked. Lieutenant Bob Grandin, Captain Frank Riley, Warrant Officer Cliff Doherty. These names meant something in Phuoc Tuy. When the call came in, and it always came in, these were the men who answered. The call sign was Dust Off for medical evacuations, Bushranger for armed gunships, Albatross for general transport. Every Australian soldier in country knew those call signs by heart, because one day they might need them. The average age? 23. Some barely old enough to drink back home. But here, in the furnace of war, they became something else. Something harder. Something necessary. The door gunners, often the youngest on board, had perhaps the most exposed position, strapped in by a single harness, leaning out into open air at 100 knots, watching for muzzle flashes in the jungle below. The crew chiefs knew every bolt, every hydraulic line, every quirk of their aircraft. They could diagnose problems by sound alone, a slight change in rotor pitch, a vibration that shouldn't be there. Because in Vietnam, mechanical failure didn't mean landing at the nearest airfield. It meant going down in hostile territory. Every mission started the same way. Weather report, enemy activity, coordinates, contingency plans. The Australians were meticulous, some said, obsessively so. but that attention to detail kept them alive. Their area of operations: Phuoc Tuy Province, 1,100 square miles of dense jungle, rubber plantations, rice paddies, and mountains. The Viet Cong had been there for years, knew every trail, every bunker system, every ambush point. The Australians were the new arrivals, but they were fast learners. The heat was relentless, 40 degrees Celsius in the shade, and there was no shade in a Huey. Pilots flew in flight suits soaked with sweat. Crew chiefs worked on scorching metal with bare hands. Medics waited in the heat, knowing the call would come. And then there was the monsoon. Rain so heavy you couldn't see 50 meters. Flying by instruments alone. Trusting your training. Trusting your instincts. But the Australians adapted. They always adapted. When the Americans said conditions were too dangerous to fly, the Aussies found a way. When standard tactics didn't work in the jungle, they invented new ones. The Viet Cong noticed. In captured documents, enemy intelligence reports specifically mentioned Australian aviation tactics, the unpredictability, the low-level approaches that gave no warning, the courage or madness of pilots who would land anywhere, anytime, under any conditions. One captured diary read, "The Australian helicopters are different from the Americans. They come in low, very fast. By the time we hear them, they are already landing. We cannot prepare. We cannot escape." This was their world. A world of adrenaline and exhaustion, of split-second decisions and consequences measured in lives. A world where your crew became your family, because they were the only ones who truly understood. Mateship. It's an Australian word, with no perfect translation. But here, in the skies above Vietnam, it was everything. You flew for your crew. You fought for your mates on the ground. You landed in hell itself, if that's what it took to bring someone home. And you did it again the next day. October 1967. A patrol from 7 RAR had walked into an ambush near the village of Bin Ba. 3 men down, bleeding out in the first minutes. The call went out. Captain Frank Riley was in the air in 90 seconds. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Bob Grandin, crew chief, Corporal John Williams, door gunner, Private Michael Thompson, medic Corporal Peter Davies. 5 men, heading into a hot landing zone. Riley pushed the Huey to its limits. Speed was life. Every second counted. The wounded soldiers were losing blood. Without immediate evacuation, they wouldn't last an hour. A hot LZ. Every pilot's nightmare. It meant enemy fire was active. It meant you'd be a slow-moving target. It meant your aircraft, packed with fuel and ammunition, could become a fireball in an instant. Riley didn't hesitate. The approach was textbook Australian. Low and fast, using a tree line for cover until the last possible moment. Then up and over, dropping hard into the clearing. Thompson on the door gun opened up immediately, suppressing a tree line 200 meters north. Tracer fire walked toward them. Riley held the hover, rotor wash flattening the elephant grass. Davies was out before the skids touched ground. The wounded were bad. Sucking chest wound, severed femoral artery, head trauma. He worked with the speed of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Because he had. An RPG round hit the tree line 30 meters away. Shrapnel pinged off the fuselage. Williams spotted the shooter, directed Thompson's fire. The M60 chattered, brass casings cascading out the door. Davies had the first casualty stabilized. The second was touch and go. The third was unconscious, but breathing. They were loaded in 45 seconds. a new record none of them wanted. Riley pulled pitch, and the Huey clawed for altitude. More fire from the tree line. A round punched through the tail boom. Catastrophic if it hit the wrong spot. It didn't. 8 minutes later, they were at the field hospital at Vung Tau. All 3 casualties survived. Riley's aircraft had 17 bullet holes. It was back in service the next morning. For Riley and his crew, it was just another Tuesday. This scene played out hundreds of times during Australia's involvement in Vietnam. The statistics tell part of the story. Over 12,000 medevac missions flown. Survival rate for casualties who made it to the helicopter, 97%, the highest of any conflict in history. But statistics don't tell you what it felt like. The weight of responsibility. The terror of landing under fire. The overwhelming relief when you got them out alive. The medics carried the heaviest burden. They weren't just treating wounds. They were performing combat surgery in the back of a shaking helicopter, often while taking fire, always racing against time. They held pressure on arterial bleeds while the aircraft banked hard. They intubated patients while rounds punched through the fuselage. They held hands and whispered reassurances to 19-year-old soldiers who knew they were dying. And sometimes, despite everything, they lost them anyway. Those were the missions that haunted them. The ones where you did everything right, and it still wasn't enough. Where you landed in time, got them out, flew like hell to the hospital, and they died in your arms anyway. But they kept flying. Because for every one they couldn't save, there were 10 they could. 10 Australian soldiers who went home because a pilot was willing to land in hell. 10 families who got their sons back. That was worth any risk. The Bushrangers. Australia's armed helicopters, bristling with firepower. 7.62mm miniguns, 70mm rocket pods, M60 machine guns in the doors. They were beautiful and terrible in equal measure. May 1968. Operation Ton Thang. An Australian company had pinned down a Viet Cong battalion in a rubber plantation near Bien Hoa. The enemy had superior numbers and prepared positions. The call went to Bushranger. 2 gunships, Bushranger 16 and 17, lifted from Nui Dat. Pilots, Captain David Wilkins and Lieutenant Peter Scott. Each aircraft carried 2,000 rounds for the minigun, 14 rockets, and 4,000 rounds for the door guns. They would need all of it. The coordination was surgical. Ground commander marked enemy positions with colored smoke. Artillery walked fire across the tree line. And then the Bushrangers came in. Wilkins rolled in first, diving at 60 degrees. The minigun spooled up to 4,000 rounds per minute. From the ground, it sounded like the sky was tearing apart. Rockets away. 14 impacts along the enemy tree line in 4 seconds. Scott came in behind, offset by 100 meters, catching the Viet Cong as they scattered from Wilkins's fire. For the Viet Cong, it was overwhelming. They'd faced artillery before, could wait it out in bunkers. They'd faced infantry, could use the jungle to their advantage. But this aircraft that could see them, track them, follow them, wherever they ran, this was different. A captured Viet Cong soldier later reported, "We could not fight them. The helicopters saw everything. When we moved, they shot. When we stayed still, they shot. There was nowhere safe." The Bushrangers made 6 attack runs. Between them, they expended all rockets, nearly all minigun ammunition, and most door gun rounds. The Australian infantry advanced under their cover, meeting minimal resistance. When the shooting stopped, the Viet Cong battalion had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Both aircraft had taken fire. 17 had a damaged hydraulic line. leaving Scott fighting the controls all the way home. But they made it. They always made it. This was combined arms warfare at its finest. Artillery suppressing enemy fire, infantry advancing under cover, helicopters providing precision strikes and real-time intelligence. Each element supporting the others, multiplying their effectiveness. The Australians didn't invent this concept, but they perfected it. The key was communication. Every aircraft had a forward air controller on the ground, usually an infantry officer who understood both air and ground tactics. He was the conductor, orchestrating this deadly symphony. It required trust. The ground troops had to trust the pilots wouldn't hit them. The pilots had to trust the FAC's coordinates. The FAC had to trust his radio equipment wouldn't fail at the critical moment. Usually, it worked perfectly. Sometimes, it didn't. Friendly fire incidents happened. In the chaos of combat, with smoke obscuring the battlefield and everyone shooting at once, mistakes were made. An artillery round landing too close. A gunship mistaking friendly positions. These weren't talked about much, but they happened, and the men who experienced them carried that weight forever. But more often, far more often, the system worked. Australian helicopters became the eyes, ears, and hammer of the task force. They found the enemy, fixed them in place, and destroyed them. And they did it with a precision that impressed even the Americans. 3 a.m. A 6-man SAS patrol geared up for insertion into the long high hills known enemy territory. Their mission: surveillance of a suspected Viet Cong headquarters. The insertion had to be silent, invisible, perfect. Pilot Warrant Officer Cliff Doherty. He'd done this before dozens of times, but it never got easier. Flying at night, no lights. Navigating by terrain features you could barely see. Dropping soldiers into an area you knew was crawling with enemy. One mistake, and everyone dies. The approach was low and slow. Any lower, and they'd be in the trees. Any faster, and the noise would alert every VC in the area. Doherty flew by feel as much as instruments, the slight change in air pressure near terrain, the way moonlight reflected off different vegetation. The landing zone was barely large enough. A natural clearing in dense jungle, maybe 20 meters across. Doherty brought the Huey to a hover, precisely centered. The SAS patrol slipped out silently, swallowed by darkness in seconds. 8 seconds on the ground. Then they were gone. The patrol would be on their own for 7 days. No resupply, no support. If they were compromised, extraction would be immediate and probably under fire. 4 days later, they were compromised. The SAS had been spotted by a Viet Cong patrol. Now they were running, enemy close behind, heading for the nearest clearing large enough for a helicopter. They were outnumbered 15-1. Doherty was airborne in minutes, but the extraction point was 20 minutes away. The SAS might not have 20 minutes. He pushed the Huey past redline, 120 knots faster than she was designed for. The aircraft shook, turbines screaming, but she held together. The SAS patrol reached the clearing with the Viet Cong right behind them. They formed a defensive perimeter, pouring fire back into the jungle. But ammunition was running low, and the enemy kept coming. Doherty saw the clearing a mile out, saw muzzle flashes in the trees surrounding it, saw his mates trapped in the middle. He didn't slow down. The approach was suicide by any tactical standard. Straight in, no covering fire. Enemy on 3 sides. But there was no time for tactics. There was only time to get them out. The door gunner opened up before they even landed. The SAS patrol sprinted for the helicopter, still firing. One man went down, hit in the leg. His mate grabbed him, dragged him forward. They piled in, 5, 6, all accounted for. Doherty pulled pitch before the last man was fully aboard. A rocket-propelled grenade passed so close the crew chief could feel the heat. The Huey staggered into the air, overloaded, underpowered, shot full of holes. The engine temperature gauge was in the red. Oil pressure was dropping, and they still had 20 kilometers to friendly territory. Doherty coaxed every last bit of performance from that aircraft. She gave him everything she had. They made it. Barely. The hydraulic system failed as they touched down. The engine seized 30 seconds later. But they made it. All 6 SAS soldiers were extracted. 1 wounded, 5 unharmed. The aircraft was written off too much damage to repair. But Doherty would fly again tomorrow, in a different bird, to pull out different soldiers from a different hell. Because that was the job. Extraction missions became legendary. The Australians developed a reputation. No matter where you were, no matter how bad the situation, they would come for you. The Americans noticed. They started requesting Australian extraction teams for their own special operations. The highest compliment came from a U.S. Special Forces colonel. "Give me Australian helicopters for extraction. They're either the bravest pilots I've ever seen or the craziest. Probably both." The Australians took it as a compliment either way. August 1966. The Battle of Long Tan. 18 Australian soldiers dead, 24 wounded, and 1 helicopter pilot who refused to quit. Flight Lieutenant Frank Riley. Yes, the same Riley from earlier was conducting ammunition resupply runs into Long Tan during the height of the battle. His Iroquois was the only aircraft still flying in the area. Every other bird had been grounded by weather and enemy fire. Riley kept flying. The weather was impossible. Monsoon rain so heavy you couldn't see the ground. Wind shearing across the rubber plantation. Lightning strikes all around. And below, Australian soldiers were running out of ammunition, surrounded by over 2,000 Viet Cong. Riley made the calculation every pilot dreads. He knew the odds. Knew that flying in these conditions, into a hot LZ, with zero visibility was borderline suicidal. He also knew that men would die without ammunition. He went in, flying on instruments and instinct, descending through clouds he couldn't see through, toward a landing zone that was being overrun. When he broke through at 100 feet, he was directly over the Australian position. Tracer fire from multiple directions. The Viet Cong knew the helicopter meant resupply, and they concentrated fire on it. Riley held the hover while his crew kicked out ammunition boxes. 45 seconds, an eternity under fire. Rounds punched through the cockpit, missed him by inches. The aircraft shuddered with impacts. But he held steady. The soldiers on the ground grabbed the ammunition and immediately put it to use. The Australian position held. The Viet Cong assault faltered and then broke. Riley pulled out. Aircraft trailing smoke. Hydraulic fluid streaming from multiple hits. He made 3 more runs that day. Each time, the aircraft took more damage. Each time, he brought back wounded soldiers on the return trip. Each time, he went back. On his final run, the aircraft was so shot up it could barely fly. His co-pilot had been wounded by shrapnel. His crew chief was performing field repairs in mid-flight. Riley made that run anyway. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross. His citation read, in part, "His courage, determination, and outstanding flying skill in the face of extreme danger were directly responsible for saving many Australian lives." Riley's only comment: "I was just doing my job." Riley wasn't alone. During Australia's time in Vietnam, helicopter crew members earned 4 Distinguished Flying Crosses. 25 distinguished flying medals, and countless commendations for bravery. Captain Bob Askew, who landed his damaged helicopter to rescue a crew that had been shot down and then flew both crews out in an aircraft that should never have gotten airborne. Warrant Officer Ray DeScrocker, who made 37 resupply runs in a single day during Operation Overlord, each one under fire. Lieutenant Gordon Butterworth, who continued flying with a severe head wound, refusing evacuation until all wounded soldiers were extracted. And the door gunners, whose names are less remembered, but whose actions were no less heroic. Men like Corporal John Moore, who remained at his gun despite being wounded twice, covering his pilot's emergency landing in hostile territory. The crew chiefs, who performed miracles keeping aircraft flying in impossible conditions, who climbed out onto skids in mid-flight to clear jammed weapons, who stayed with their birds when everyone else had evacuated, refusing to leave her behind. These weren't superhuman. They were Australian soldiers who found themselves in situations that demanded superhuman efforts. And somehow, they delivered. Not all heroism happened under fire. Sometimes, it was the pilot who flew one more mission when he was beyond exhausted, because soldiers needed resupply. Sometimes it was the medic who held a dying soldier's hand and lied to him, told him he'd be fine, gave him comfort in his final moments. Sometimes it was simply showing up, day after day, knowing each flight could be your last. The Australians didn't have more aircraft than the Americans, didn't have better technology, didn't have superior firepower. What they had was innovation born of necessity. Take their approach to terrain flying. American doctrine called for altitude, stay high, stay fast, minimize time in the enemy's effective range. Good theory. The Australians went the opposite direction. They flew low, very low. Skids, brushing treetops, using hills and valleys for cover. Approaching landing zones from unexpected directions. It was riskier, one mistake, and you'd be in the trees. But it had a crucial advantage. The enemy had almost no warning. Captured Viet Cong intelligence reports noted this repeatedly. Australian helicopters approach at very low altitude. First indication is rotor noise, but by then, they are already landing. Impossible to prepare ambush. The Australians also pioneered integrated tactics. Not just air supporting ground, but air and ground working as a single unit, each aware of the other's capabilities and limitations. They embedded forward air controllers with infantry units. These weren't desk officers calling in strikes from a map. These were pilots who'd flown combat missions, now on the ground, understanding exactly what their aircraft could and couldn't do. The results were remarkable. Response times dropped, accuracy improved, and perhaps most importantly, trust developed. Infantry knew their air support, understood the ground situation. Pilots knew their ground elements would mark targets accurately and suppress air defenses. Then there was night flying. Most helicopter operations shut down after dark. Too dangerous, too difficult. The Australians operated around the clock. They developed their own night flying techniques, using moonlight and starlight instead of instruments where possible, learning to judge altitude by the sound of rotor wash on vegetation, trusting instincts developed through hundreds of daylight hours. This capability saved lives. A soldier wounded in a night ambush didn't have to wait until dawn for medevac. He could be in surgery within the hour. The Viet Cong learned to fear the night because darkness no longer protected them. Logistics and maintenance were constant challenges. Parts that should have arrived weekly sometimes didn't come for months. Aircraft developed problems that weren't in any manual. The Australian ground crews became masters of improvisation. Need a part that won't arrive for 3 weeks? Fabricate one from scrap metal and hope it holds. Hydraulic line damaged? Patch it with what you have and pray it doesn't fail over hostile territory. They called it bush mechanics, making do with what you had, because lives depended on keeping birds flying. The result? Australian helicopters maintained an operational readiness rate that impressed even the Americans. Despite fewer resources, harsher conditions, and smaller support staffs, they kept more aircraft flying more missions. But perhaps the most significant innovation was psychological. The Australians understood that helicopters weren't just tools of war, they were weapons of terror. They exploited this ruthlessly, varying their approach patterns so the enemy could never predict where they'd come from. Showing up at unexpected times, midnight extractions, dawn raids, operations during monsoons, when the Viet Cong thought they were safe. A former Viet Cong platoon commander, interviewed years after the war, described it this way: "We could hide from artillery, go deep underground. We could avoid infantry patrols. We knew the jungle better. But the helicopters, they were everywhere and nowhere. You never knew when they would come. That constant uncertainty, it wore on us." This was deliberate psychological warfare. The Australians created an environment where the enemy couldn't rest, couldn't feel safe, couldn't plan around helicopter operations because there was no pattern to plan around. They also used helicopters for intelligence gathering in ways that multiplied their effectiveness. Door gunners were trained observers, reporting enemy positions, trails, bunker systems. Every mission became a reconnaissance mission. This intelligence fed back into planning. Patterns emerged. The Australians learned where the Viet Cong moved, where they resupplied, where they felt safe, and then they struck those locations. The Viet Cong adapted, of course. They learned to dig deeper bunkers, to disperse more widely, to move only when weather grounded helicopters. But each adaptation reduced their effectiveness. If you're scattered to avoid helicopter strikes, you can't mass for your own attacks. If you're hiding underground, you can't control the population. If you only move during monsoons, your logistics suffer. The helicopters didn't just kill enemy soldiers, though they did that effectively. They disrupted enemy operations, degraded enemy morale, and denied them freedom of movement. In military terms, they owned the operational space. None of this happened by accident. Australian helicopter crews trained relentlessly. Emergency procedures until they were automatic. Navigation until they could find any coordinate in Phuoc 2 blindfolded. Communication until they could understand garbled radio calls in combat. After every mission, they debriefed. What worked? What didn't? How could they do better next time? The learning never stopped. The Americans noticed. U.S. Army aviation units began requesting attachments with Australian squadrons, wanting to learn their techniques. Some of the tactics pioneered by Australian crews in Vietnam became standard doctrine in U.S. Army aviation. By 1969, Australian helicopter crews were considered among the best in Vietnam. They were called in for the difficult missions, the impossible extractions, the operations nobody else wanted to touch. And they delivered. Again and again, the aircraft themselves became symbols. Each Huey had a personality, quirks known only to its regular crew. Number 853 pulled slightly left on takeoff. Number 907 had a vibration above 110 knots. Number 872 had been shot down twice and rebuilt both times. Her crew called her the Phoenix. Crews painted names on their aircraft: Wallaby Airlines, Bush Turkey, Antipodean Express, small acts of personality in a standardized military world. Reminders that these were Australian birds, flown by Australian crews. operating Australian style. The Viet Cong developed their own names for Australian helicopters. The translations vary, but they all conveyed the same message: respect mixed with fear. These were adversaries to be taken seriously. A captured Viet Cong training document from 1968 included specific instructions for engaging Australian helicopters. Do not reveal position until aircraft has committed to landing. Concentrate fire on cockpit and engines. Be prepared to withdraw immediately after engagement, as reinforcements will arrive quickly. By the end of the 1,960 seconds, the Australian helicopter presence in Vietnam was a finely tuned machine. Pilots who knew their area of operations intimately. Ground crews who could perform miracles with limited resources. Tactics proven in hundreds of combat missions. And most importantly, absolute trust between air and ground elements. This wasn't the largest helicopter force in Vietnam, wasn't the best equipped, but measured by effectiveness per aircraft, by missions accomplished, by lives saved, and enemies defeated, the Australian helicopter crews stood second to none, and the men on the ground knew it. When the call went out and the reply came back in that Australian accent, there was a palpable sense of relief. Help was coming, and help had never let them down. December 1972. The last Australian combat troops withdrew from Vietnam. The helicopters, those that remained airworthy, flew home aboard transport ships. But the legacy they left behind endured. The numbers tell part of the story. During Australia's involvement in Vietnam, over 12,000 medical evacuation missions flown. More than 100,000 troops moved by helicopter. Thousands of tons of supplies delivered. Countless combat support missions. But numbers don't capture the human dimension. The soldiers who survived because a pilot landed under fire. The families reunited because a medic kept someone alive long enough to reach surgery. The battles won because gunships arrived at the critical moment. The international military community took notice. Australian helicopter tactics became case studies at military academies. The integration of air and ground forces, the aggressive medevac doctrine, the emphasis on night operations, all became standard practice. An American general writing after the war stated, "The Australians proved that helicopter warfare was as much about courage and innovation as it was about numbers. They achieved results disproportionate to their size through superior training, tactics, and sheer determination." For the men who flew and crewed those helicopters, Vietnam was the defining experience of their lives. Not because they sought glory or adventure, but because they were tested in ways few people ever are, and they didn't break. They speak of it carefully now, decades later. The pride is evident. Pride in their mates, their units, their accomplishments. But so is the cost. The friends lost, the close calls, the memories that won't fade. Not all of them came home. 18 Australian helicopter crew members were killed in action in Vietnam. Others were wounded. Some aircraft were shot down. Their crews lost in hostile territory. Their names are remembered at the Australian War Memorial, on unit honor rolls, in the memories of those who served with them. They paid the ultimate price doing what Australian helicopter crews always did, going into danger to bring their mates home. The Australian Army aviation that exists today traces its lineage directly back to Vietnam. The lessons learned there in blood and adrenaline and countless hours of flight time shaped modern doctrine. When Australian Army pilots train today, they learn the tactics pioneered over the jungles of Phuoc Tuy: low-level flying, aggressive medevac, integration with ground forces. The heritage is tangible, passed down from those who learned it the hard way. That reputation built in Vietnam endures. When coalition operations need helicopter support in challenging conditions, Australian aviation units are sought after. The tradition of excellence continues. Even former enemies acknowledge it. Vietnamese military historians writing about the war specifically mention Australian helicopter operations. Their respect is grudging, but genuine. They faced these crews in combat and came away impressed. A Vietnamese military analysis from the 1982nd noted, the Australian helicopter forces demonstrated exceptional skill and determination. Their willingness to operate in conditions that grounded other units and their aggressive rescue operations had significant impact on the morale of their ground forces. The jungle that once echoed with rotor blades and gunfire is quiet now. The landing zones grown over. The fire base at Nui Dat returned to rice paddies. But the impact of what happened there, of what those Australian helicopter crews accomplished, that remains. For the children and grandchildren of those who served, the stories carry weight. These aren't tales of invincibility or easy victory. They're stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances with courage and competence. Some of the aircraft survive. In museums, at memorial sites, preserved as reminders of what they were and what they did. Visitors stand beside them now, trying to imagine what it was like inside. The heat, the noise, the fear, the adrenaline, the weight of knowing lives depended on your actions. Current Australian Army aviators sometimes visit the old operational areas in Vietnam. They walk the old base at Nui Dat, fly over the old areas of operation, try to understand what their predecessors experienced. The geography is the same. The dangers aren't, but the standards set there of courage, skill, and dedication to mates, those remain. When veterans speak to current helicopter crews, there's a connection that transcends generations. Different wars, different helicopters, different enemies, but the same fundamental truth. You fly for your mates. You land when others won't. You bring them home. The story of Australian helicopters in Vietnam isn't about domination through overwhelming force. Australia never had overwhelming force. It's about maximizing what you have through innovation, courage, and determination. It's about ordinary Australians, pilots, gunners, medics, crew chiefs, who found themselves in an extraordinary situation and rose to meet it. They didn't ask to be heroes. Most of them don't consider themselves heroes even now. They were just doing their job. They'll tell you. Just looking after their mates. But ask the soldiers they pulled out of hot LZs. Ask the wounded they evacuated under fire. Ask the ground troops who called for fire support and watched gunships arrive within minutes. Ask them who their heroes were. In the skies above Vietnam, from 1962 to 1972, Australian helicopter crews wrote a chapter of military aviation history that stands alongside any in the world. They did it with skill, with courage, with an absolute refusal to leave a mate behind. The machines are silent now, the rotors still, the guns cold, but the legacy flies on. In the doctrine taught to new pilots, in the standards expected of Australian military aviation, in the pride of a nation that remembers what a small group of determined people accomplished when everything was on the line. They were Australian helicopter crews in Vietnam. They were outnumbered, operating in hostile territory, facing an enemy that knew every inch of the jungle. And they dominated, not through numbers, not through technology, through courage, skill, innovation, and an unbreakable commitment to each other. That was their war. That is their legacy, and it will not be forgotten.